By the last week of November, almost everyone who drove past Mercer Farm had noticed the same strange thing. Hannah Mercer was spending money on a hole in a hill. The hill rose behind the equipment barn, where dead goldenrod rattled in the wind and wild grapevine had swallowed an old stone arch almost to the top. Near its base stood a warped wooden door the color of wet ash, half buried beneath leaves. The iron latch had rusted into a reddish knot, and moss filled the cracks between the stones. When Hannah first forced the door open, the hinges gave a long metallic groan that carried across the empty yard, as if the hill itself objected to being disturbed. Cold, stale air rolled over her boots. It smelled of wet limestone, rotting wood, clay, and the faint mineral scent of water that had sat too long in darkness. Her flashlight found broken shelves sagging against the walls, roots hanging from the ceiling, and nearly 2 feet of black mud covering the floor. The root cellar had been built in 1913. Nobody in Hannah's family had used it seriously for decades. Yet there she was at 24 years old, crawling in and out of it on her knees with buckets of mud, while the November wind cut across 63 acres of harvested ground. Her tractor still leaked hydraulic fluid onto a sheet of cardboard under the shed. 3 sections of fence leaned toward the creek. 2 patches on the barn roof lifted whenever the wind came hard from the west. Instead of fixing any of those things properly, Hannah bought lime mortar, rough-cut lumber, gravel, drain tile, galvanized vent pipe, thermometers, humidity gauges, and enough wooden crates to fill the bed of her pickup twice. The trucks on the county road began slowing. One afternoon, Hannah was dragging rotten shelf boards from the cellar when a red Ford eased almost to a stop beyond the mailbox. 2 men in seed company caps sat inside. The passenger looked toward the hill. The driver glanced at the leaking tractor, then back at Hannah. Their heads tipped toward each other for a moment before the truck rolled on, gravel snapping beneath its tires. The next morning at the feed store, Hannah carried a 50-pound bag of mineral salt toward the counter. 2 older farmers stood beside a display of insulated gloves, paper coffee cups in their hands. Through the front window, the galvanized vent pipe was visible above the tailgate of Hannah's pickup. One farmer looked at the pipe. The other looked at the mud on Hannah's jeans, and then at the white envelope from Mercer Community Bank sticking out of her coat pocket. A small smile passed between them. Hannah set the salt on the counter, paid, and walked back outside. By early December, she had spent almost $4,200 on the cellar. Her tractor was still leaking. Her checking account was nearly empty. And every evening, when she carried another armful of lumber toward the hill, the old cellar seemed to swallow a little more of whatever future the farm had left. What the people driving past Mercer Farm did not know was that Hannah had already spent most of the year watching things disappear. Mercer Farm lay in the rolling country of southern Ohio, where fields folded into wooded draws and gravel roads curved between barns that had stood longer than most of the families living around them. The farmhouse sat beneath 2 silver maples near the road. Its white paint had worn thin around the porch, and one gutter sagged at the corner. Beyond it stood the low equipment shed, a leaning tobacco barn no longer used for tobacco, and fields falling gently toward a creek lined with sycamores. Hannah's father, Daniel Mercer, had farmed the place nearly his entire adult life. By the time his heart began failing, the farm was already under pressure. 2 wet springs had delayed planting. A dry August had cut corn yields. Fuel costs had climbed. An old baler needed a transmission rebuild. The walk-in cooler beside the packing shed had failed twice in 3 years. Daniel kept working longer than he should have. Hannah came home after 2 years of agricultural coursework at a community college and never went back. She learned to change bearings before breakfast, sort potatoes after dark, mend fence in sleet, and make $20 of diesel last farther than it had any right to. At first, her father still insisted on driving the tractor himself. Later, he rode in the passenger seat of the pickup with an oxygen concentrator humming between his boots while Hannah checked fence lines and talked through planting dates. By February, he no longer went outside. He died in March. The farm did not become Hannah's in some clean, ceremonial way. It arrived as a stack of envelopes on the kitchen table, an empty pair of work boots beside the mudroom door, and a coffee mug she left untouched beside the sink because washing it felt too much like admitting he was not coming back. There was an operating loan, equipment debt, property taxes, a repair estimate for the cooler compressor. Together, the debts tied to the farm came to a little over $78,000. The bank had not begun foreclosure proceedings, but Hannah was already behind on one payment. By spring, she would need to show enough cash flow to justify another operating season. There was an easier option. A developer had asked twice about buying the eastern acreage along the county road. It was the best ground on the place, flatter than the rest, with deep soil that held moisture well through July. Selling it would have covered most of Hannah's immediate problems. It also would have cut away a field the Mercer family had planted for 4 generations. One afternoon in late fall, Hannah came around the curve in her pickup and saw fluorescent ribbons moving above the eastern field. She slowed. Several survey stakes had been pushed into the ground just beyond the ditch, bright plastic flags flickering in the wind. The developer had sent someone to mark a possible boundary. Hannah pulled onto the shoulder and shut off the engine. The sudden quiet made the ribbons seem louder somehow, their thin plastic snapping in the cold air. She sat behind the wheel for nearly a minute before getting out. At the first stake, Hannah stopped with both hands in her coat pockets. She remembered crossing that field at 6 years old, her boots sinking in wet spring ground, while her father carried her over the worst places. Years later, on that same acreage, Daniel had taught her to judge soil moisture by squeezing a handful between her fingers and watching whether it crumbled or held. The fluorescent ribbon whipped against Hannah's wrist. She stood there until her fingers went numb. Then she drove home without calling the developer. That spring, instead of planting as much corn as possible, Hannah reduced acreage and devoted more ground to crops she could sell directly through farm stands, restaurants, and winter markets. She planted potatoes, carrots, onions, beets, pumpkins, and squash. The strategy could produce more income per acre than commodity corn, but it created a problem every produce grower understood: storage. Fresh crops were worth money only as long as they stayed fresh. The Mercer walk-in cooler was old, inefficient, and completely dependent on electricity. The compressor had failed the previous January during a cold snap, forcing Daniel and Hannah to move crates into the barn and trust the weather. 2 days later, a warm front arrived. The smell of that loss stayed with Hannah. Sweet rot, wet cardboard, potatoes collapsing beneath her fingers, apples turning soft around the stems. By the time the compressor was repaired, nearly $1,000 of produce had gone to the compost pile. By August, Hannah knew she could not afford a new refrigeration system. A used generator large enough to run the cooler, water systems, and farmhouse would cost thousands more, not including fuel. That was when she remembered the stone door in the hill. At first, the root cellar was only another unfinished job her father had mentioned and never reached. Then, while cleaning the attic after his funeral, Hannah found a dented metal cash box beneath an old quilt chest. Inside were farm ledgers. Some dated to the 1930s. One belonged to her grandfather, another was older. Tucked between them was a hand-drawn plan of the cellar dated 1913. Hannah carried the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. Dust moved in a beam of late-afternoon light above her father's empty chair. For several minutes, Hannah did not open anything. She simply rested one hand on the cracked leather cover of a notebook. A faint smell of machine oil still clung to it. Her father had used notebooks just like these. Suddenly, Hannah could see him at the end of the table on winter evenings, reading seed catalogs with his glasses low on his nose, writing figures in the margins of envelopes. She remembered the way he tapped his pencil twice before making a decision. Near the end, his hands had trembled when he lifted a coffee cup, but when Hannah spread a field map in front of him, his finger had still traced drainage lines with absolute certainty. For months, she had been too busy to grieve properly. There had always been a bill, a broken belt, a calf needing attention, a field that could not wait. That afternoon, with the old notebook beneath her hand, all of it stopped. Hannah lowered her head and sat in the fading light until the kitchen disappeared into shadow. Then she opened the book. The pages did not contain a secret formula. They recorded outdoor temperatures, storage losses, frost dates, moisture levels, and vent positions. Her grandfather had added notes during the severe winters of the late 1970s. He had written down which crops lasted longest, where condensation formed, which shelves stayed too damp, and how closing the lower vent during extreme cold could keep potatoes from freezing. The notes were repetitive, almost stubbornly plain. That was why Hannah trusted them. The north-facing hillside stayed cooler than the farmhouse basement. The surrounding soil softened sudden temperature swings. Cold air entered low. Warmer air escaped high. Root crops kept well in darkness and high humidity. Apples needed separation from potatoes. Carrots lasted longer when packed in damp sand. The cellar was not a refrigerator. It was a way of letting soil and stone do work that electricity usually did. Before spending money, Hannah tested it. She placed a temperature sensor inside the abandoned chamber and another outside beneath the barn eave. On warm afternoons, the outdoor reading climbed rapidly. At night, it fell. Inside, beneath several feet of earth, the temperature moved only a fraction as much. That was enough for Hannah to begin. It was not enough for anyone else. By the time restoration started, the cellar became a public measure of whether Daniel Mercer's daughter had any idea what she was doing. At the diner near the highway, farmers came in before sunrise with dried mud on their boots and coffee steaming in their hands. One morning, Hannah stopped for breakfast before hauling gravel. As she crossed toward the counter, a man by the window looked through the glass at her pickup, where two vent pipes stuck above the tailgate. Another man followed his gaze and then looked toward the road leading back to Mercer Farm. A fork scraped across a plate. Someone folded a newspaper. No one said Hannah's name. Nobody needed to. She took her paper bag from the counter and walked back into the cold. She did not argue, because arguing would not make the cellar hold one more degree of temperature. Before sunrise, she fed the two remaining cows and checked their water. After that came fieldwork or repairs. In the evening, she carried stone, lumber, and gravel up the hill. After dark, she worked beneath a yellow construction lamp with an extension cord running from the barn. Slowly, the cellar changed. When Hannah scraped old mortar from the stone, grit collected beneath her fingernails. The air inside always felt heavier than the air outside. Water ticked from the ceiling after rain. Her boots made a hollow scrape across the stone floor, and every small sound grew larger underground. The drag of a crate, the click of a thermometer case, even her own breathing. Once the drainage trench was finished, the standing water disappeared. Once the shelves were raised, the wood stayed dry. Once the two vents were installed, Hannah could feel a faint stream of air against the back of her hand. The first time she opened the rebuilt door after loading the harvest inside, the old hinges gave their familiar groan. Behind it came the smell of potatoes, cold limestone, damp sand, cedar crates, and apples sharp enough to cut through the earthy air. The cellar began to feel less like a hole in the hill and more like another living part of the farm. Hannah learned its moods. The first week, one corner stayed too wet, so she raised the crates 6 inches from the floor. The second week, the shelf near the intake vent became too cold, so she moved the potatoes farther inward. Apples went into a separate compartment. Carrots and beets were packed in damp sand. Onions stayed drier and closer to airflow. Hannah wrote everything down. Date, outdoor temperature, cellar temperature, humidity, vent position, spoilage. For weeks, nothing dramatic happened. That was almost the hardest part. The cellar did not suddenly make the farm profitable. It did not repair the tractor. It did not erase debt. December arrived with bills stacked beneath a chipped ceramic salt shaker on the kitchen table. The tractor starter failed. A livestock water line froze. 2 restaurants cut their orders after the holidays. Hannah still had thousands of pounds of produce underground, but stored food was not cash until somebody bought it. Then came the first serious failure. A warm, wet spell settled over the county just before Christmas. Rain soaked the hillside for 3 days. Inside the cellar, the stone walls began to sweat. Water formed in beads along the ceiling and followed the mortar lines down toward the lower shelves. Hannah smelled the problem before she saw it. Sweet, sick, wrong. At the back of the cellar, she pulled out a crate of potatoes and pressed her thumb into one near the bottom. The skin collapsed beneath her finger. Another potato had gone soft beside it, then another. By the time she finished sorting, almost the entire crate was lost. She carried the spoiled potatoes outside after dark. They landed on the compost pile with dull, wet thuds. On the final trip, Hannah stood behind the barn with the empty crate hanging from one hand. Rain hissed against the dead grass. Across the yard, the kitchen window glowed yellow. Her father's chair was visible through the glass. For the first time since restoring the cellar, something inside Hannah gave way. Not panic, not anger, exhaustion. She had been making decisions for 9 months with nobody sitting across the table to tell her when one of them was foolish. Her father would have noticed the condensation sooner. The thought came quickly. The next one hurt more. Her father was not there to notice anything. Hannah lowered the crate and pressed both hands against the wet barn siding. For a few seconds, she let herself cry where no one could see her, shoulders shaking in the rain, while cold water ran from the brim of her cap. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and went inside. The bank statement waited on the table beside the property tax notice and the repair estimates. The metal cash box sat near the corner. Hannah opened her grandfather's notebook again. Near the back, she found an entry about a January thaw and moisture gathering behind the lower shelves. She read it twice. Before sunrise, she was back in the cellar. She opened the upper vent wider, moved the dampest crates, increased the air gap behind the shelving, replaced wet sand, and checked every potato by hand. By New Year's, the cellar had stabilized again. Most of the crop was keeping better than anything the old electric cooler had managed the winter before. Still, outside Mercer Farm, nobody had much reason to care. Then the freezing rain came. The forecast in the second week of January sounded ordinary at first. Southern Ohio had seen ice storms before. Hannah filled livestock troughs, topped off the pickup, stacked extra firewood beside the porch, and checked the cellar vents. By late afternoon, rain began freezing onto fence wire. By dark, every branch around Mercer Farm glittered beneath a clear shell of ice. The grass crackled under Hannah's boots. Somewhere beyond the creek, a tree limb snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. At 9:17 that night, the lights went out. The refrigerator hum vanished. The water pump stopped. The furnace fan wound down. For a moment, the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath. Then sleet ticked against the windows and branches began breaking in the woods. The next morning revealed how bad it was. Power lines sagged beneath ice. Utility poles leaned toward the road. Oak limbs blocked the state route. A transformer had burned near town, leaving a black mark in the snow. By day 2, restoration estimates had grown worse. Gas stations without backup power could not pump fuel. Farmers with generators began counting gallons. Some ran tractors to power emergency systems, but diesel was limited and roads were dangerous. Mercer Farm went cold. Hannah kept one room of the farmhouse warm with the wood stove. She hauled water in buckets, broke ice from the cattle trough, cooked on a camping burner, and worked in gloves that never seemed to dry. The electric walk-in cooler beside the packing shed was useless. But beneath the hill, almost nothing changed. On the third morning, Hannah climbed through the snow and pulled open the cellar door. The old hinges gave the same low groan they had made since the first day. Cold air met her face. Then came the smell. Earth, apples, limestone, damp sand. Nothing sour, nothing rotten. Her flashlight swept across the shelves. Moisture glimmered faintly on the stone walls. The thermometer read 39 degrees. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 17. Hannah lifted a carrot from the sand and bent it. It snapped cleanly in her hands. The potatoes were dry. The apples were cold, but unfrozen. The beets were firm. She adjusted the lower vent and closed the door again. Each morning of the blackout, the hinge made that same sound. By the 6th day, Hannah no longer heard neglect in it. She heard a door opening exactly when she needed it to. Across the county, people were beginning to lose food. Porches became temporary refrigerators. Garages became freezers. Coolers were packed with snow. For several days, the weather itself helped. Then fuel became the bigger problem. A farmer 3 miles north drove past Mercer Farm pulling a generator on a small trailer, 2 red gasoline cans strapped beside it. The next afternoon, the same truck came back slowly. The trailer was empty, and only 1 fuel can remained. The grocery store in town had limited backup power, enough for lights and several refrigeration units, but not enough to save everything. The church near the high school opened a warming shelter with a diesel generator. By the 6th day, the shelter needed food. Hannah carried crates out of the cellar and loaded potatoes, carrots, onions, squash, and apples into the pickup. The vegetables left a damp, earthy smell in the cab. At the church parking lot, vehicles crowded beneath power lines, still heavy with ice. Steam fogged the windows of the building. When a volunteer opened the back of Hannah's truck, he paused. The vegetables did not look like emergency food. They looked freshly harvested. Families began coming to Mercer Farm as roads reopened. Hannah weighed potatoes on the old barn scale and packed carrots into brown paper bags. Receipts went into a metal tin. One afternoon, a truck stopped near the barn. Hannah recognized the driver as one of the men who had watched her buy vent pipe at the feed store. He carried 2 boxes of onions and a crate of apples to the tailgate. Before climbing back into his truck, he looked toward the hill. His eyes stayed there for several seconds. This time, there was no smile. On day 8, the weather changed again. A warmer front pushed temperatures above freezing. Snow slumped from barn roofs. Icicles dropped and shattered on concrete. Food that had survived on porches and in sheds began warming too quickly. Inside the root cellar, the thermometer barely moved. The hillside released its cold slowly. The stone remained steady. When Hannah pressed her palm against the limestone, it felt dense and faintly damp, as though the winter itself had settled inside the walls. By day 10, crews restored power to parts of town, but the roads around Mercer Farm remained dark. Hannah's hands were cracked around the knuckles. Her shoulders hurt from hauling water. Her boots never fully dried. Still, every morning, the old door opened with the same deep groan, and the same cool breath rolled out of the hill. On the evening of the 11th day, Hannah was standing at the kitchen sink when the light above her flickered. Once, twice, then it stayed on. The refrigerator motor shuddered to life. The furnace fan began turning. The small lamp beside her father's chair filled the room with yellow light. Hannah did not move immediately. On the table beside the chair sat the coffee mug she had finally washed months earlier but had never managed to put away. Warm air began pushing through the floor vent. Hannah looked at the empty chair, then pulled on her coat. Outside, the snow along the hill shone blue beneath a clear night sky. Broken branches lay along the fence. Far down the road, another farmhouse had lights again. Hannah climbed to the cellar and opened the door. The hinge groaned. Cool, damp air moved over her face. The thermometer read 41 degrees. 11 days. No gasoline. No diesel. No generator. No electricity. The food was still there. The blackout did not make Hannah rich. What it did was more important. It kept Mercer Farm from losing the little margin it had left. The produce stored underground continued selling through late winter, instead of becoming compost. The seed potatoes Hannah had reserved for spring survived in good condition, which meant she did not need another loan simply to replace planting stock. The blackout sales, the preserved crop, and the planting costs she avoided gave her enough cash to catch up the overdue bank payment and cover the property tax bill. In March, Hannah returned to Mercer Community Bank carrying a folder of receipts. Under the fluorescent office lights, the banker went through winter sales totals, storage losses, seed inventory, and projections for spring. Hannah sat across from him, with dried mud still along the edge of one boot. When he reached the final page, he looked through the glass wall toward the parking lot, where Hannah's pickup sat between two polished SUVs. Then he closed the folder and slid the revised paperwork across the desk. 2 days later, Hannah drove to the eastern field just before sunset. The survey stakes were still there. Winter had faded the fluorescent ribbons. Some were torn at the edges, others snapped weakly above the thawing grass. Hannah parked beside the ditch and walked to the first one. Months earlier, she had stood in that same spot until her fingers went numb because she could not imagine how to keep the ground. This time, she wrapped one hand around the stake and pulled. It resisted. She leaned back and pulled harder. The wood came loose with a wet sucking sound from the soft spring soil. Hannah carried it to the pickup. Then she went back for the next one. She kept walking until there were no fluorescent ribbons left moving across the eastern field. By spring, the people who had once slowed their trucks to inspect Hannah's mistake began stopping for different reasons. The county extension agent spent nearly an hour inside the cellar, studying her temperature records and vent layout. A neighboring farmer crawled behind the lower shelves to see how Hannah had installed the drainage tile. Another family cleared brush from the entrance of an abandoned cellar on their own property. Hannah showed them what had worked. She also showed them what had failed. The rotten shelf, the condensation line on the wall, the place where the potatoes had spoiled in December, the vent that needed closing during hard freezes. She never presented the cellar as perfect. That would have dishonored the months she had spent learning it. The following season, Hannah planted more storage crops and built a winter CSA around potatoes, carrots, beets, onions, squash, and apples. The cellar reduced spoilage and cut the number of hours the old walk-in cooler needed to run. Electric bills fell. Winter income steadied. The farm still had hard years. There were repairs, droughts, weak markets, and mornings when Hannah stood in the barn doorway wondering how 63 acres could demand so much from one person. But the debt began moving in the right direction. Down. Not dramatically, not all at once, year by year. A few winters later, snow covered Mercer Farm before Christmas. The tractor beneath the shed was newer, though still second-hand. The barn roof no longer leaked. The fence beside the creek stood straight. Beyond the county road, the eastern field lay unbroken beneath a pale layer of frost. No fluorescent ribbons moved in the wind anymore. Behind the machine shed, the old survey stakes were stacked against the wall, weathered gray now, their bright plastic flags long gone. At sunrise, Hannah walked behind the barn carrying a clipboard. She reached the hill and pulled open the cellar door. The old hinges gave their familiar low groan. Hannah had cleaned them, tightened them, and oiled them more than once over the years, but she had never silenced them completely. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped wanting to. The sound no longer belonged to an abandoned room. It belonged to winter mornings, muddy boots, stored harvests, and work that had become part of the farm again. Inside, wooden crates lined the stone walls. Potatoes rested in darkness. Carrots lay beneath damp sand. Apples occupied their own compartment. The air smelled of soil, cedar, cold limestone, and fruit. A thermometer hung beside the doorway. On the shelf below it lay 2 notebooks. One was new, its pages filled with Hannah's handwriting. The other was old, its leather cover worn smooth at the corners, her grandfather's. Between the pages was the hand-drawn cellar plan dated 1913. Hannah ran one thumb across the faded pencil line marking the lower vent. For decades, the family had treated the root cellar as a relic. Her father had never managed to restore it. For a long time, Hannah had wished he had. Now she understood something different. Daniel Mercer had left her the farm in pieces. Debts, tools, fields, old records, unfinished work. He had not left instructions explaining how she was supposed to survive without him, but he had left enough traces for her to learn where to look. Hannah closed the old notebook and placed it beside her own. Above the doorway, carved into the stone arch, was the year the cellar had been built, 1913. Outside, the eastern field carried no survey flags. Inside the hill, the old hinge still groaned whenever the door opened. One marked the future Hannah had refused to surrender. The other carried a past she had refused to abandon. And between them stood 63 acres still bearing the Mercer name. The winter blackout had lasted 11 days. What Hannah learned from it lasted much longer. The thing that saved Mercer Farm that January was not a new machine, a larger loan, or technology she could not afford. It was a forgotten room inside a hill, built by people who understood how cold moved through stone, how moisture stayed in soil, and how food could be protected by the earth itself. Hannah had not saved the farm by returning to the past. She had saved it by paying attention to what the past still knew. And on the shelf inside the cellar, beside a notebook written generations before she was born, Hannah continued leaving records of her own for whoever would open that wooden door next.